Welcome to my video. Today's colors: Hansa Yellow Light, Naphthol Red, Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Sienna, Yellow Ochre, Ivory Black, and Titanium White. I'm also using a quick dry medium. We're going to begin to sketch in the scene today using just a little bit of burnt sienna and some Gamsol. Gamsol solvent is what I'm using. The canvas today is a canvas panel. It's an 11 by 14. The paintbrushes that you'll see me using today are a 6, a 4, and an 8 hog bristle brushes made by Princeton. Their Ashley line, which is an inexpensive hog bristle line. The easel I'm using is a Maybeth easel. It's a full box easel. Today we're working on a winter scene. Here I'm just getting a map together of the big shapes that I see. In this case today, I'm using my imagination. It recently snowed in the area, and so I'm using my memory of some of the scenes that I saw in selecting this composition, which is basically going to be a group of trees and a snowy lane which led back to a house or a farm. I don't really know. I could only see the lane. What really struck me about the scene was just the amazing light as it bounced off the snow, creating various colors. And I noted it in my memory, and now I'm going to try to translate what I saw, what sparked my imagination, into paint. Here I'm just creating some lines to indicate where some of the trees are going to go. Some folks prefer to use a small notebook and to do a thumbnail sketch. As you already know, most of the time I tend to just sketch right on the canvas. Perhaps I'm just too impatient. Here I had put in that horizon line, but of course it's not very pretty to actually see a line across there. And so now I'm taking the sketch a little bit further, thinking about my darkest darks and where those are eventually going to go. There was a really nice snow line, if you will, where you could clearly see that someone had earlier that day plowed some of it off to the side. And so it created a lot of these wonderful shadows on the left side of the canvas as you're watching this. And then the light was more concentrated on the actual path, the driveway, if you will, and then the right side of the painting. Of course, whenever you're doing a painting, you will notice that the sky is usually always the lightest, value-wise, color-wise. The next lightest would be your ground plane, and your most intense dark is usually going to be your verticals, your trees, your shrubs, your houses. So here I'm getting a sense of remembering where the darks were, where the lights were. Here again, I'm now mixing a darker dark, if you will, made from ultramarine blue and some burnt sienna. And some quick dry medium. I want this to be rather thin though, so you will see me basically scrubbing it in. And of course, at this stage of the painting, notice that it's just a map. It's not full of detail, and it doesn't have to be full of detail. And I am trying to give an impression of what I saw. I'm not attempting to recreate a photograph. I have been most influenced by what we might call impressionist painters. In particular, in recent times, I've especially interested in the work of Tom Thomson and some of the Canadian artists that worked with him. And one of the things that really drew me to him was his use of color, his sense of experimentation with composition, and lack of detail, not creating something very beautiful without much detail at all from the Canadian wilderness scenes that he experienced firsthand. He did most all of his small works are, of course, plein air outdoor paintings. A few of his larger works were more of a studio paintings, and quite honestly, a lot of critics will say that his Tom Thomson's best works were actually his small works. So if you have never heard of Tom Thomson, you can go on YouTube, and there are plenty of videos telling you about the history of him, his paintings. It's really quite a fascinating story. He died at a relatively young age under some, well, it's one of the mysteries. We don't know exactly how he died. But he only painted for a few years, and it's kind of amazing the level of artistry that he was able to achieve in that short period of time. And some compare him to Vincent van Gogh in that regard, and the story of the man and his paintings go hand in hand. And provide a ton of interest. All right, so you can see I'm really getting the darks in there now. Going over the map of the sketch of the burnt sienna, and now putting in some of these darks. A lot of this will get covered up, but that's okay. What I want to do is have some of this shine through. This allows me to be very free with my brush strokes, as you can see here. I'm not really thinking too hard or long about any of this. I'm remembering some of the shadows and some of the contours of the land that caught my attention from earlier in the day. And now I'm simply putting them down as quickly as I can. And sometimes that's really a helpful practice, to attempt to put down the shapes as quickly as possible, not thinking too hard about it. I find that when I labor to think too hard or to stressed about getting the various details I see in a scene, that those paintings often do not turn out as well as when I simply go with the emotion that I'm feeling, and the sense of beauty that I just experienced, and trying to capture that as quickly as possible without really thinking too much about it. And I'm also trying to vary the brushstrokes in such a way that there is a sense that it is mirroring what we find in nature, which is certainly not scripted at all. And oftentimes, if you labor too long on your trees or your grasses, anything in your painting, that it can also produce some difficulties. You will find that you get into a mode of making patterns without really being able to see that you're making patterns. You're making the same shapes over and over again. You are laboring too much in one particular area and not moving around the canvas. Notice that I'm trying to fill this canvas up first with this first impression as quickly as possible. And I'm painting all over the place. I'm not just concentrating on one particular area or trying to finish one particular area. I really want to finish putting an initial block in for the entire canvas. Here I am stretching and getting a paper towel. I've also been experimenting lately with really concentrating on getting the darks really dark. It is amazing the details that you can bring out with your different tonal values, but you have to make sure that you start dark enough, because you can always lay in lighter shades of color over top of the darks. But if you start too light, what I've discovered is that it makes it much more difficult to really pull out the colors, because you only have a few values to go if you start too light. And then trying to put darks over top of lights is not usually the best way to go. At least I don't do it that way. And most artistic artists and videos that you will watch will usually tell you start with the darks and then move to the lights. Now here, I want to get some lights going, and so I'm going to begin putting the sky in. One thing I've also noticed that the sky usually doesn't have too many details. It's just a matter of a few color variants, and so that is a good place to start. Once I get the darks on there, the sketch of the big shapes done, I will start in on the sky. And also this way, notice here, I'm not fussing too much because I know that this tree is probably not going to be there. It's going, there's just a skeleton, if you will, that's left behind here. And so I'm just plugging in some places with some color. I'm not thinking about really creating a tree right now. I'm just thinking about, okay, I want to get places where the sky holes are going to be, where the sky is coming in, where it kind of mixes with the browns and creates a sort of effect that there could be a few leaves, certainly some color shifts as you're looking up at these trees, even though it's a winter scene. And so that's kind of what I'm going for right now. So I'm not worried at all. I know that I can come back in and clean this up later if necessary. And sometimes what happens is you create various accents, right? Brush strokes that really work more effectively than you would ever imagine or plan to create on your own. And so getting the colors in first really can help. Here too, I'm thinking about where the sun's coming from, where my lightest lights are going to be, where the darkest darks are going to be. And of course, these tree sets over here on the right side help keep the viewer into the painting. You'll notice that what's going to happen here with the composition, Edgar Payne would call this an S composition, because I'm going to take you through this snowy lane that has been newly plowed and take you back into the painting in a kind of an S shape, starting from the left-hand side and moving towards that tree grouping that you see pretty close to the center of the painting. You'll kind of notice where I've got the lane kind of marked in with the triangle. You saw that earlier, and now it's still present there in the very foreground. moving back in to get the distance, reminding me that the colors at the end of the triangle need to be lighter than the colors near the foreground. Here I'm mixing different variants of blue right within the same pool of color. That's always helpful. You don't need to stress too much about creating colors that don't touch one another. In fact, you really want to stay away from doing that because you can end up with some really beautiful shades and contrast by being able to see the difference right on the palette before you ever put those two colors together on the uh, painting surface. And so here, and of course, as you go up in the sky, as you look up towards the sky, it usually is a little bit bluer at the top than the bottom. And usually there's one side over another that's a little bit bluer or darker. And so here you can see that taking place as it's a little bit darker over on this left hand side where the trees are closer to the viewer. And so we want to get these colors in. And here, once again, I'm not thinking about creating trees or sky holes. What I'm thinking about doing is okay. I didn't do an underpainting per se, and so there are little places of blank canvas, and I want to get some of this blue color mixed into the browns at this point, and that can be an effective way of creating sky holes without the danger of making shapes that look artificial. And so you'll see me come back in and do that. Getting close now to that white line, and what I'd like to do is I will clean off my brush here soon and mix those two together so that you don't see any line there. And right now, you see how you can see the definite line, and in a few minutes, I'm going to take a dry brush, clean this one that I've been using entirely off, and then using the brush, I'll take some vertical strokes and help make that color vary between the two shades now. Once again, here notice I'm allowing that blue to get mixed in with the darks to create a sort of in between color that doesn't stand out quite so much, but yet gives the illusion of sky holes, sky places where you can see the sky coming through. And of course, with the winter scene, you're not going to have many leaves on these trees, so you're going to see more of the blues and the browns, the darker colors, not the greens. And I'm just touching the canvas lightly, as you can see that. I don't have a whole lot of the blue paint on my brush, and just varying a few of the brush strokes to basically cover those little spots where the canvas is still showing. So I'm really kind of working on that. Not worried too much about it at this point. I know that there'll be plenty of opportunity to put other colors on top of that. And here I'm taking that just a little bit darker blue, remembering that as you go into the trees, it's going to filter out some of the light that we're seeing and make it a little bit darker. And so I want to, while that's still on my palette and on my brush, I want to mix some of those colors into the background there. And I'm also pulling out a little bit of the browns to mix with those blues all across that tree line, which should help with the sense of color harmony. And once again, my whole aim right here, I'm just thinking cover the canvas as quick as possible. And here I'm just noticing that there was a lot of that burnt sienna showing through, and it's kind of a really strong brown at this point. And so I want to soften those edges at this point. When you're doing landscapes, think about like this. A building has sharp edges, obviously, and those sharp edges pull your attention to it. But when you're in nature, almost nothing has sharp edges, especially if you are painting things that are in the distance. Right here, I'm noticing that I'm really liking the effect so far. It may not look like much yet to you, in terms of this tree line, but I believe that there's a sense of mystery here, that your mind is reading it as a woodland area, and doing some of those mixing and shape forming in its own right, rather than relying on me providing a lot of detail. And now I'm just taking that same brush after I've cleaned it off, and it's basically a dry brush with a little bit of those blues still in it, and I'm just up and down motions, vertical motions, to mix it, and notice I'm varying the strokes, and I'm also making sure that some of this brown, this wonderful brown color, gets mixed into it as well, creating a sense that there's some, smaller branches, maybe a few dead leaves still hanging on to the tree, and so this creates a sense of realism without and detail without really doing much work at all. At least I'm hoping you see that, and I'm seeing it and finding it helpful. Here I'm doing the same thing around the edges of those other tree groups, and now going back in and finishing up the sky, for now at least. I will come back in and put some clouds in, but of course clouds are lighter color, right? They're going to be primarily in the winter titanium white, and to stress the cold weather, I'm not even going to mix in a little bit of Hansa yellow at this point. So for winter scenes, stay away from the use of the Hansa yellow for the clouds, and go just with titanium white, which will really accentuate the cold color and the weather being colder, because titanium white's a rather cold color. Now here, notice I'm just tapping the colors and allowing them to sort of mix naturally, so that way I'm not erasing the color, and taking care of some of the harsh edges of some of those other colors. Now, if you just step back just a little bit, as I'm doing here, to see that, I'm so far very happy with how that sky looks to me. That sky looks pretty realistic at this point, and I think I'm pretty confident that the tree line's going to work at this point in time. And so now I'm going to start mixing a purple, because what I saw more on the ground plane, as we're looking at the shadows and how the light is hitting on the snow, you get a lot of variations of blue and purple. And so now you can see me mixing my pool of colors inside of each other to see what tonal values I want to go. And the first mixture I just didn't feel was dark enough. Like I mentioned, you want to go as dark as you can, because you can always lighten things up and paint over top of it. When you're doing the darks, you just need to remember to it's okay to paint rather lightly, so that way, if you're not too thick, it will be easy to come in with thicker, lighter toned paint over top of it. Now I noticed that there were some spots on the canvas that didn't have any paint, and so those are going to be taken care of with this darker purple mixture. Once again, I'm not fiddling too much with it. I'm just trying to cover the canvas area. So here we go with coloring and covering some of that. And as you can tell, I think that this purple mixture really creates a wonderful color harmony with some of the browns and the blues that were put down earlier. Notice how that color is really popping up. Grabs your attention. Of course, at this point, everything hasn't been covered, and so we have to reserve some of that judgment until we do have it colored. And then what we're trying to do is get it close enough, and then we can always make some adjustments once we get the block-in stage, if you will, done. Here, I'm putting some titanium white into that same pool of color. No need to mix all kinds of tiny little colors. There are some artists that decide to mix all their mixtures first and then go into it. That would drive me nuts. So I don't do that. Here you notice that I just used the same pool of color, and now I've added some titanium white, and now this pink color is going to push it back. It may not appear that way right at this moment, but you'll see as the painting progresses that as the colors recess, they lose their intensity, and so they're not as dark. And so right up at that the main alley or lane to this home or whatever's back there, farmhouse, you can tell that I'm pushing back the tree group that's kind of in the center of the painting, and then extending it just ever so slightly, and a couple of touches of that color in other places as well, just for color harmony. Here also, for color harmony and for a little bit of color variation here in the blues, I felt like this was also a good color to use to suggest a little bit of the branches and a few of the leaves that still hanging on to these trees at this point in time. One of the things I learned from looking at a lot of the paintings of Tom Thompson was the fact that he is able to create a sense of detail without really providing much detail, and that's really interesting to me. And so notice here, these are just dabs of color. I'm not thinking about trees. I'm not thinking about bushes. I'm just thinking about, do these colors reflect what I experience? Do they give the sense of beauty that I saw in the scene? And I will come back later in the painting and I can add some more details if those are needed. But there's no sense at this early stage in painting to get too hung up. Notice if I lay excuse me, if I labored for a long time creating the branches right now, then uh, I'm liable to overwork the painting. I want to get all of the first thin layer of shapes and colors in, the shadows, the lights, the darks, and I can always go back into the painting with some thicker paint and do those highlights, and then it becomes more, well, it simply becomes easier to sense that you don't need that many details to really make a painting work, and you will see that in today's painting. So now this is also a purple. This doesn't lean as much towards the pink end. It leans more towards the bluish purple. So this is what I read as a darker color. And so now I'm putting it on my map of colors where some of the dark land plane is. So notice where the burnt sienna you see, I'm going over top of that. And here again, I'm just trying to vary the brushstrokes. I'm not worried about detail at all. I'm just noticing that that color is very similar to the purples, and that's the pinkish purples, and that's what I want, because I want most of these ground plain colors to react that way. Some of the lighter areas on the canvas that you see right now, they're standing out as white blobs at this point. Those are places where I know I want some highlights. Those are going to be the lightest lights. And so I'm leaving those alone at this point and concentrating on getting some of the very darker darks and going over top of the browns without completely covering them, allowing some of that to peek through. And I'm noticing that this is producing some good color harmony, I think. I think it's very pleasing to the eye right now and is reminiscent of my experience of the sun shining on the snow, the darks, the lights that I saw. Now, once again, still into that same pool of color, we had the pinks, we had the purples, and now I want to make this a little bit more blue. And so I'm taking ultramarine blue, a little bit more titanium white, looking for that tonal value by squinting. You can see there on the palette, when my hand's not in the way, that all three of those colors, if you squinted, are very similar to each other. So that helps me understand that it's the same tonal value, and I can see that by mixing those colors on the palette. And now as I put those down, if you squint, you can see that the blue and the purple, if you squint, mix together. And then don't squint, and you can tell that, oh, wait, those pops of color are very effective. And partly they're effective because they create interest. It's varying the purple, but it's the same tonal value as the purples and the pinks. And so it's doing what it needs to do on the canvas and on the painting. It's the same tonal value as the other colors that I'm putting down for the ground plane. Just like the other colors, that the light pink and the light blue in the sky, you can tell if you squint, those are pretty much the same tonal values. Not a big difference there. And certainly lighter than what you see in the ground plane and what you see in the tree line. Now I'm cleaning off the brush again. Notice I'm cleaning most of the time, I'm cleaning my brush off with just paper towels. I'm not cleaning it off with the Gamsol every single time. And notice some of the other colors were still in the brush, and now I'm making another mixture of color. And that's perfectly okay. If you become too obsessed with an absolutely clean brush, number one, it's going to take you a lot longer to paint. And number two, it's really not going to be that helpful to you. Because as you can tell, what makes some of these colors very interesting is that they're mixtures of one another. And they don't have to be exactly different than the other colors. Some kind of mixture is really helpful. Now see how this lighter blue, if you squint, you can really tell that this is a lighter color. Its tonal value is much different. So these are the lighter lights. Notice it's not that light. This is not a mixture with tons and tons of titanium white. And sometimes we make the mistake as beginning painters believing that, oh, if you want something to be tonal value very light, we'll just add a lot of titanium white and you'll be fine. No, that's actually a recipe for disaster. What I would always recommend is use as little titanium white as you possibly can in your mixtures. Reserving titanium white for your highlights. And often I find that darker paintings with a few light highlights really get your attention more so than something that has a real high chroma. When you go to a museum and you look at some of the landscape painters of the past, one of the common things that I see is that so many of the landscapes, of course, many of them were narrative type landscapes back then, right? Maybe a windmill, some people, some farm animals, and then oftentimes some of the landscapes kind of look like the landscape itself was an afterthought. But notice how often the trees are very dark, the greens are very dark. The emphasis is on making sure that everything else is pretty dark, so that way the few lights that are placed on it by the painter really do stand out. So here I've just completed some of the lights. I'm going to play around with that a little bit. Right now it's not as recognizable as what I'm trying to attempt to do, but like I said, until you get some initial colors down, it's hard to judge all of the tonal values. And now that I've covered it, now the task is going to be to shift some of the colors, to find out, okay, what isn't working right now. Like right now, it doesn't look like shadows and lights in that foreground, and I'll come back to that to add some darks on top of it, rather than to try to get lighter and lighter. That's not going to be possible. So here, what I'm doing is that these trees are closer to the viewer, and therefore you can actually see some clumps of snow that are accumulating on the branches. And so that's what I'm trying to do is add some of that detail onto at least the trees that are closest. And then even with the back trees and brush line, I'm putting in a few of those lights to give the kind of illusion that there's falling snow that's kind of tucked away in between the branches and so forth, with therefore creating these kind of specks of light, if you will. Think about snow and how it's so bright on the ground, and even in the trees it sparkles, and so that's what I'm trying to work on there. Now here again, cleaning the brush. This time I am using the Gamsol to clean the brush. Yes, you notice there's some kind of an attachment on the easel today. Well, that's my iPad, which has a reference photo that I'm using more as an inspirational footnote, if you will. It's not the scene. It has some distant trees, and that's all I'm using it for, is to help me with thinking about how a woodland looks like, and so that's what's on the iPad at this point, helping me with just that particular detail. Now here I'm taking just straight titanium white, and these are going to become clouds. And so one method that I think is really simple for creating clouds is to boldly put some of the strokes that are going to become your clouds right on top of the other colors of your canvas. Notice that these are pretty thick brush strokes of titanium white. Now right now those look kind of goofy, but what's going to happen is I'm going to go back into it and soften the edges until they look soft like clouds, and then not touching the inner part of the stroke. So right here I'm just bringing that down the painting to give it a little bit more contrast next to that focal tree, if you will. And there you go. And now I'm going to clean up those cloud edges. Well, pretty soon I'm going to do that. Notice how I cut into some of that there on the, you can always take one color and cut into it. It's kind of a wrestling match, if you will, from the darks to the lights, and blending where those edges touch each other. Now here, I'm just tapping with a dry brush the edge, and I'm not really thinking about anything other than attempting to get kind of random marks, because, like I said, I want it to be rather unpredictable. When you try to form a cloud, they often look like cotton balls, and that's not how they look in nature, right? But notice how when I'm just flicking and tapping, and then I come away from it, it looks far more natural, I think at least, than something I might concoct myself. And notice how those edges have now disappeared, and now hopefully that is soft enough to be believable. And once again, the titanium white makes this picture very cold, along with the other colors, which are predominantly cool colors. In other words, there's an absence of yellow and orange. I haven't used any Hansa yellow, and only a little bit of Naphthol red at this point in time. And now here, I'm using that titanium white, since it's already on the palette, already on my brush, for a few essential highlights. So now you can tell that this straight titanium white is certainly much lighter than even those light purples and pinks that I put down on the canvas. And that was intentional because I wanted to make sure that I could get lighter so that I could really accent these highlights. And what I'm thinking about is that lane and the shadows. And it's going to take a little bit of time here to get the shapes I want to make it feel like a composition, the S composition, and to a sense of how the lights and the darks are working on the ground plane. And what's going to happen is I'm not going to be happy with the lights, and I'm going to go back in with my darks. But that's okay because obviously that's trying to go too much. You can't go any lighter than titanium white that I've just put down. But that's all right because I know that I can mix some darker darks and come back in and cut back into these light highlights, and essentially use that to mix colors right on the palette. So here it's clear to me that it doesn't look like an S composition yet. The highlights are kind of all over the place, and so that has to be changed. But while I've got the titanium on my brush, I want to go back in with a few highlights in these trees of where the snow might be nestled in between the branches and so forth. And the first part's just varying the brush strokes, and then eventually I'll go back in, and because those are such sharp edges, they call too much attention to themselves at this point, and at least in my estimation. And I'll go back in and just do the method of tapping out some of those edges a little bit to soften them. No rhyme or reason to this. I'm just trying to vary the strokes so that they're interesting shapes. If anything, I probably put too many of those highlights here, and you'll notice later on I'll come back in and soften them, and some of those will actually be kind of erased from the final painting. I basically used just two brushes during this. Now that I'm looking at it, the 4 and 6, one for the lights and one for the darks. That can be helpful to you as well as you are learning to paint. If you keep one brush for your lights, then you don't have to clean it as much, and you won't dirty your colors with titanium white or ivory black. In fact, if you're going to paint at all with the ivory black, you may want to have just one brush dedicated to having that color, because that will be the hardest color to get out of your brush, obviously, when you're cleaning it. But if you use a couple of brushes for your darks and a couple of the brushes for your lights, that can help. Now, you just saw me stand up, and what I did once in a while, it's always helpful. Today I'm sitting down primarily to paint this, to get up and get away from the canvas and see it at a distance, because that's how the viewer hopefully is going to see it. Hopefully, most viewers are not going to come up right up to the canvas and look at every little stroke, although most artists do, because we like to see what kind of brush strokes, what kind of technique was used. But our intention is that the viewer will see it as they enter the room, and be drawn to come closer to it, but to see it all at once, and to see the colors kind of blend together from a distance is part of the goal of impressionistic paintings. Here, just cleaning off the whites. And I think in just a few moments you'll see me go back into this painting with some more darks. Another thing you'll see me do is I tend to, when I'm done with the underpainting, done with the sketch, the underpainting, and have covered the canvas, is then I will start working from top to bottom. I'll get that sky in, I'll work on the verticals, and then the foreground. And so that way there's a sense that everything's getting done at around the same time, with the same puddles of color, in other words, thicker paint, etc. Okay, at this point I decide to give more attention to the trees. So this is a mixture of ivory black and some burnt sienna. I'm just letting the brush do the work for me. I'm wanting a few trunks, and so this is still I think this is a number 6 flat bristle brush. Eventually you'll see I'm going to switch to a number 2 liner brush. In some lines of paintbrushes they call it a rigger brush, but it's a very long, thin brush. There it is. This is the Princeton Aspen line. It's a synthetic fiber, and this is really essential for just adding a few details. And you'll see I start, and then I just pull the brush up, and I'm constantly going back to the paint, which is a mixture of a little bit of the Gamsol, the color, as well as some of the quick dry medium. And then I'm just pulling it up to give a sense of some of the details. And now, one thing you don't want to do is have a lot of these branches leave the painting surface. In other words, you don't want them necessarily going off the left-hand side or off the right-hand side in such a number that it draws your attention and your eye off of your painting onto somebody else's painting, right? So you'll notice that most of these branches are going in the direction of in towards the painting rather than out. Although you still need a few, and notice like that one, it's coming in from the left, but it's clearly moving towards the right. So that way, if your eye goes over there or is naturally looking, just like for most in the Western world, we read from left to right, and so that can be an effective technique, is to pull a few of the branches across that left-hand side to reinforce that you're looking at it from left to right, which is pulling you into the composition, into the painting and the details. So this is going to go on for a little bit just to let you know. And now's probably a good time. I probably should have done this earlier. I always get involved. If you like the content, please subscribe to the channel and give a thumbs up. That makes all of this possible. In the description, I will leave a link to my Patreon channel, which is quickly being transformed with more and more of the videos that I've placed. For now, they're just the YouTube videos. They're the same ones that you're seeing for free, but what you're doing on the Patreon channel is that you're signing up to donate a particular amount, maybe $5, $10, $15 a month, to help support me and my artistic endeavors so that I can continue to produce these videos. As many of you know, a lot of professionals who teach painting and show you their painting, they will charge $100 and some for one painting demo. So one way to look at it from the Patreon channel is that you're really helping me out, of course, and it's very economical because $5 a month is not too bad. That's basically an entire year's worth of painting demos for the price of one. Now, certainly I understand that I'm not at the same level as a lot of those other videos that you would actually purchase, but I still believe that oftentimes you can learn more from folks that have not reached what we might call the most professional level, or folks that are not recognized yet for all kinds of award-winning paintings, because I'm probably a little bit closer to your speed and know some of the problems that you've encountered, because I have more recently encountered those problems and learned how to tackle some of those. And hopefully also provide you with a little bit more confidence, because many of you are going to be able to paint paintings just like the ones that I'm showing you right now, because that's your ability level as well. And also to see that you're not alone in this. Many of these paintings that I'm putting up in the video fashion may not be great paintings. In fact, one of the things I've gotten used to is just trying to not censor myself too much, knowing that some of these paintings will be good and you'll get some value out of. Some of these paintings will not be my best paintings, and that's okay as well, because you can learn just as much from a failed painting as you can a real successful painting. And so I try not to delete the recordings of some of the paintings that maybe are not my favorites, or not ones that I think are the most outstanding of my work at this point. But any rate, notice what I just did there. I'm trying to now get the sense that there's this plowed lane where the sun is hitting and taking you back, and then some of the shadow area created by some of these trees. And notice with just a few of those strokes right there, I think I achieved the sense of drawing the viewer back into the painting in a much more effective way. And notice how the sides, the left-hand side, which is where the kind of the hill is going to be, already looks a little bit darker now because of lightening, or rather darkening, the center of that lane. Now here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce some darker darks in the foreground area, which will help to create the highlights. So when you create highlights, remember this, you don't always have to go lighter. Sometimes what you need to do, which is the easier method, is to go darker. And notice that this is a much darker purple purplish blue, and how I'm now taking this color and helping to indicate that this is the area where the trees are producing shadows on the ground, and so it's naturally darker than the other side of the painting, the right hand side, which is going to remain a little bit lighter. And notice there that little piece I just covered up, how that white was popping up too much and creating an interest area that was a little bit obnoxious. And so as soon as I knocked that down, it helped the painting immensely, I think. And just a few touches on the other side help to draw your attention back to the middle path to give the impression that this is a little country lane that's been recently plowed. And what's drawing our attention is the ways that the shadows are working. Here, I'm putting a shadow across the road caused by some of these trees, obviously. It kind of effectively works as a pause as well to get your attention on going back towards that path, but at the same time kind of stopping for a little bit of a respite right there where you see that shadow, and noticing some of the other strokes that are functioning as some highlights. Here, I just got up again to take a look at how this is progressing and what it looks like from a distance, which makes it easier for me to see any mistakes, repetition, strokes, that kind of thing. Notice that the palette is predominantly purples, reds, and blues, and how those really work together, I think, to create a wonderful, pretty harmony. Even the burnt sienna that I used earlier on it's a reddish brown, and so that reddish brown is still there, and it's serving as a sort of accent color for the lighter shades that I put down afterwards. Now I'm just cutting back into some of those colors, working on some of those edges so that we don't get any patterns. Some of those branches look a little bit too big for me, causing your attention to go up towards the top of the painting a little bit too much. So that's what I was clarifying and taking out at that point here. At this point in the painting, I'm just about done. Keep in mind that I have got other paintings, so if this is the first video that you've discovered from me, at the very end there'll be some suggestions for you to watch. And of course, again, subscribe, and that way you'll be notified as soon as I release something new. Notice those couple last strokes right there in the center on that lane kind of blended those colors together, but it also moved the eye even back farther into the painting. In other words, that area of interest is now even more vague, and that creates this kind of S pattern composition where your eye is moved in towards that very spot that I just painted. Here I'm just once again looking at some of those edges and these tree groupings that are a little bit further back. And now I'm going to soften some of the edges on the snow in the trees, so that way there's a sense of snow being there, but not so harsh that it immediately calls your attention to it. So notice how I'm just kind of tapping the edges of those other shapes. I'm not trying to do too much. I want to preserve some of that color. And I think now that's much better. I don't know what your observation is, but by by just suggesting a much less harsh edge to those spots of color. I think it works to produce a sort of sense that there's places where the limbs are covered with snow, and that that snow is picking up the light as well as falling on the ground, perhaps. And now I'm just doing it in some other areas as well, so that you don't get the sense that there's a little bitty dots or brush strokes on there. I think I want a little bit more of a natural edge to some of those spots. Now I'm taking out what they call a paint eraser, and this is how I make my signature, is basically cutting back into the painting, which usually if the underpainting is a sort of burnt sienna, or my sketch has been burnt sienna, that will reveal that color again, and it's not too intrusive to the rest of the painting. You don't want a signature that's going to really pop out. Of course, with these Maybeth easels, there's those metal clips that hold the panel, and sometimes you have to move those away in order to get your effect. Here I am just signing my name, David W. Poe, on the side there, taking a quick look to make sure everything is okay. If there's any last minute details I want to stick into that painting, and then I will be done. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope that you will watch the other videos I've created and will be creating. Thank you so much.